The career, reputation, and future of Lance Armstrong hang in the balance. Now, Mr. Armstrong, who's come under attack from the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency, has a return shot of his own. Reed Albergotti of the Wall Street Journal, who covers legal issues and has covered the Armstrong case for a long time, is here to explain it all to us. Reed, we all have heard the allegations against Lance Armstrong. He fired back today. What did he say?
Yeah, well, Dennis, Lance Armstrong has filed a federal lawsuit in Austin, Texas this morning. And what he's done is he's tried to take the case out of the system of Olympic justice and put it into the federal courts. Now, he's saying that the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency is essentially a state actor because they work with law enforcement officials.
Now, before we get there, the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency, no one knows what the heck that is. Explain that to the average person, perhaps, who...
Yeah, we've all heard there are doping charges against Lance, but it's actually brought by this agency, USADA, as it calls itself, which is part of the World Anti-Doping Agency, which is part of the International Olympic Committee. And what their job is to do is to police doping in sports. Now, that involves drug testing athletes, and it also involves, in cases like this, bringing charges against athletes based on witness testimony. USADA's interviewed supposedly more than 10 former teammates of Armstrong.
Now, Reed, as you put it well, this is the system of Olympic justice, and there's no legal statute that says that this has to happen. Where it gets its authority, if I understand correctly, is from athletes who individually sign to abide by the terms of whatever the doping agency or other organizations set up. Is that right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So when Armstrong competes in cycling, he agrees to go by the rules of the World Anti-Doping Agency as an Olympic athlete. Cycling is an Olympic sport.
Right.
So as part of
that, it's basically a voluntary pledge.
Right. All athletes.
And what Lance Armstrong is essentially saying in this lawsuit is, hey, this is more than a voluntary pledge. USADA has become a state actor working hand in hand with governments and law enforcement to make cases that go beyond sort of compliance or not, but really significant legal cases.
Right. I mean, what he's saying is that because USADA is a state actor, they have to go by constitutional rules of due process, and that they're not doing that. Now, USADA would say, A, they're not a state actor, and B, they do follow those rules of due process anyway. They allow an athlete to have their own lawyer and have a hearing in front of a 3-person arbitration panel.
Right. Now, I think probably something that people can relate to is it's almost like the NCAA. If you have an infraction on recruiting or other violations, you have some right of due process at the NCAA, even though that's a voluntary system.
Right. I think that the World Anti-Doping Agency and USADA have set it up so that it's a pretty fair system for athletes, or at least I don't want to use the term fair and sound like I'm taking a side here, but it's a system where athletes do have the opportunity to have a lawyer and really argue their case.
But I got to say, Reed, it seems that if he voluntarily signed an agreement, year after year, I don't know if you have to renew these year after year, but if he voluntarily signed it, that seems to me he's given his consent to abide by the rules. He can try to push to make this legal case, but in some ways, it seems like a delaying tactic.
Well, and that's certainly an argument that USADA would make, and they would say, yeah, I mean, many athletes like Armstrong have gone through this very same system. In fact, some of those athletes have even filed lawsuits in federal court and not won. So what they would say is, you know, he's, like you said, he's just an athlete going by their rules. But what they would say is that this case is really not normal. It involves infractions that allegedly happened more than 8 years ago. The World Anti-Doping Agency has an 8-year statute of limitations. It also involves a lot of witness testimony that really came out of a federal investigation, not a traditional doping investigation. So they're saying this case is different.
Right. Now let's take us back full circle. We mentioned at the top of the segment how Lance Armstrong's reputation really hangs in the balance here. You covered the situation really in depth for a long time. How are people viewing Lance Armstrong inside the cycling community? He had, as you mentioned, testimony from his own teammates who said that he was engaged in doping. So where does Lance Armstrong stand right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there always will be a debate about whether or not Lance Armstrong cheated in his sport. And those opinions about him, they really run this huge spectrum of people who believe he doped to people who believe he was completely clean and innocent during his career. Now, if he officially loses his Tour de France titles, which could happen at the end of this process, I think that you have to assume that more people will probably believe that he actually did dope during his cycling career, because there's just an official nature about it of losing those titles. Right now, he's never officially tested positive for anything in his sport.
Right, and of course he's got 7 wins, so there's plenty that hangs in the balance, and of course his livelihood in his career.
Including his triathlete career. He's been competing in elite triathlons right now, and he'd be banned from doing that. In fact, he is banned from competing in some triathlons right now just because of this case being brought.